As students, most of us have experienced it, walking out of an exam and saying, "That test wasn't on what I studied at all." As instructors, we've seen the other side of the story. We covered all of this material in class. I don't know why my students weren't able to apply it on the exam. It's frustrating for students to feel like they have no idea what it is their professor wants from them, and extreme frustration isn't a good learning mindset. There are ways, though, to maximize the great moments of teaching. Imagine grading student projects where you can see all the learning gains your students have made. Imagine the joy on your students' faces when they realize they've mastered a new skill. Having a well-aligned course really can make those moments happen easier and more often. So many of the frustrations we encounter as instructors result from misalignment in our courses. We walk in on the first day of class excited to share our knowledge and our passion with our students, to encourage them to engage with class material, and to inspire them to pursue further learning in our fields. One of the big challenges that comes along with these aspirations is that there is no clear map for how to do these things. This podcast will provide a brief overview of the concept of backward design, which is essentially the process of drawing a map between the first and last days of your course, so that your students leave your class knowledgeable, skilled, and passionate about your discipline. We call this course design process backward because most instructors focus on what content they are going to teach and what readings they are going to use, instead of looking at the end point of the course first. With backwards design, we ask ourselves, what do we want students to know, to be able to do, and to value when they walk out of the course on the last day? The map we have designed for this podcast indicates that at the end of this video, you will be able to identify the three main types of learning objectives, identify the components of strong learning objectives, and describe the connection between assessment and learning objectives. We are going to define learning objectives quite simply. They are the descriptors of what you want your students to know and be able to do as a result of taking your course. A commonly used framework for thinking about learning objectives has three categories: knowledge, skills, and values. We will quickly go over what a first draft of learning objectives in each of these three categories might look like. What knowledge do you want them to have? For example, in an introductory art history course, you might expect your students to be able to name major painters from each particular era you study in the course. That's one example of factual knowledge an instructor would expect students to have. We'll look at how we can refine this objective later in the podcast. Coming up with knowledge-based objectives is often relatively easy. Most instructors, though, want their students to go beyond learning facts and procedures and develop skills relevant to the discipline. For example, a foreign language instructor may want her students to be able to appreciate the role nuances in spoken emphasis play in effective communication in a particular language and culture. Appreciation of nuances is a skill of a more expert communicator. In other disciplines, instructors may want their students to develop computational skills, writing skills, or the ability to physically manipulate a piece of equipment in the lab or clinic. The third category in this framework includes the values that you want students to hold at the end of your course. These values are often so implicit in our discipline that we don't think to articulate them as learning objectives. For example, in the sciences, students are expected to value the scientific method as an approach to problem solving. In social work, social justice is highly valued. A learning objective related to this value system could be, at the end of the course, students will understand the importance of advocating for social justice in their professional practice. Now that we've looked at the general types of learning objectives that an instructor might have for a course, we need to look at how to optimize our learning objectives so that they are truly useful for us as instructors and for our students. Useful learning objectives typically embody 6 traits, and a good mnemonic to help you remember the components of effective learning objectives is the acronym ALARMS. A is for active, L is for learner-centered, the second A is for attainable, R is for relevant, M is for measurable, and S is for specific. Active. A useful learning objective requires your students to do something to prove that they have met the learning objective. Every learning objective should include an active verb. One resource for finding active verbs for learning objectives in any discipline can be found at the link on your screen. This website has different versions of what is often called the Bloom's taxonomy wheel. The inner circle has different categories of knowledge and skills you may want your students to develop. The middle ring provides active verbs that one can use for writing learning objectives, and the outer ring gives examples of products you could require your students to create to demonstrate their mastery of the learning objective. Learner-centered. Course objectives should be based on what your students' knowledge, skills, and values will be at the end of the course. Many instructors, when writing goals for their courses, think to themselves, In this course, I will teach the history of my discipline, including the names of the key researchers who developed the concepts we are covering. Keep in mind that what we teach may not be what our students learn, although our goal is that the two are the same. In order to increase the correlation between what we teach and what they learn, our objectives need to be learner-centered. Another aspect of learner-centered objectives is that they are written in language a student can understand, for the most part at least, at the beginning of the course. Students need to understand where they are supposed to end up. Attainable. Our courses exist within a context of real life. They take place within a full curriculum over a relatively short time period and is only one of the many obligations we and our students have to meet as people. We need to write our objectives recognizing that we will not be able to transform our students from novices to experts in just a few months. It's important to have high expectations for students, but these expectations must also be reasonable given the time period for the course, the previous knowledge of the students, and all the other responsibilities that require students and our time. Relevant. Useful learning objectives are going to be relevant to the student population that is taking our course. If we are teaching a course for non-majors, we might not need to get our students to memorize the minutiae of our field, and we may want to focus our learning objectives on what basic skills and values every citizen in our society should have from our discipline. Measurable. Every useful learning objective has assessment implicitly built into its construction. If you get absolutely nothing else from this podcast, we want you to ask yourself, how will I know my students have accomplished this? Every time you write an objective or goal for a course or unit or lesson. Remember the Bloom's taxonomy wheel. The outer ring gives examples of ways you can measure your students' learning. We will spend time later focusing on this particular trait of useful objectives. Specific. Useful learning objectives are not vague. Almost all instructors, regardless of the discipline, want their students to have improved analytical skills and better writing at the end of a course. These goals, though, are too vague to be useful learning objectives. A more useful objective specifies how a student's writing skills will be improved. For example, an instructor might include in their syllabus, at the end of this course, students will be able to write an analytical paper that includes 1. A clear, succinct thesis about their interpretation of a text. 2. Recognition of at least one other alternative interpretation of the text found in the disciplinary literature. And 3. At least 3 pieces of evidence from the text being evaluated supporting their thesis. Now that we've looked at the types of learning objectives and the traits of useful objectives, let's classify and evaluate some learning objectives, and then start thinking about assessment and alignment. Revisiting our knowledge learning objectives from earlier, which of these 3 objectives don't satisfy the alarms criteria? Why don't you pause the podcast here and try to figure it out for yourself? Well, the first 2 both have active verbs, identify and calculate, and are learner-centered, that is, they are worded to describe what the students will learn, not what the instructor is planning on teaching. All of the learning objectives seem attainable. Without knowing the details of who is in each of these courses, we can't accurately judge relevance, but it seems safe to say that these objectives are reasonably relevant to a higher ed classroom. In terms of being measurable, the top 2 objectives give an idea of what kind of assessments a student might see in the course, while the third objective is not clearly measurable at all. Again, the top 2 objectives are very specific, so it is clear that the economics learning objective needs some work. One possible revision of that learning objective can be seen on the screen. This new version includes an active, learner-centered verb, seems attainable and relevant, and is clearly measurable. This revised objective also identifies the specific context in which students will be applying this knowledge. Let's now look at our learning objectives for skills we want our students to develop. We suggest you pause the recording and look at the objectives on the screen. Which learning objective doesn't seem to fit the alarms framework? It is common for instructors to choose the word appreciate in learning objectives, but when it comes down to it, there isn't a good mechanism for assessing appreciation. In looking at the learning objective from a Spanish course, we need to reword it so that there is an active verb that lends itself to measurement. We've chosen the wording you can see on your screen. Even if your discipline isn't in the languages, you can likely imagine how an instructor might assess a student's ability to, quote, appreciate, end quote, the different Spanish accents heard around the world based on this new wording. Values-based learning objectives can be very challenging to write for 2 reasons. First, many of the values we expect students to adopt from our discipline are so ingrained for us as experts that we may not even think to make them explicit. Secondly, Coming up with active verbs to describe what a value system looks like can be very challenging. The best way to figure out how to phrase the learning objective is to ask yourself, how will I know? On the screen, you can see how we have chosen to rework one of the learning objectives from earlier in the podcast. We highly recommend you pause the video and try to rework the other one yourself. Before you move on to designing what kinds of exams and writing assignments you're going to give your students, we want to highlight how important it is to make sure those assessments are aligned with your learning objectives. Without strong alignment, when you assess your students, you may not be measuring what you think you are measuring. A useful exercise is reflecting on a test or project that your students didn't do particularly well on and asking yourself 2 questions. First, did the assignment or assessment actually tell me whether the students had met my objectives for their learning? And if the answer to that question is yes, the next question should be, did I give students ample opportunity to practice the skills they would need for the assessment or assignment? Very often, when something doesn't work well in a course, when something seems to be off, the answer to at least one of the above questions is no.